We were genuinely concerned about the issues they raised and the fact that these people had challenges. We are a business that does genuinely care about the people that work for us, and if there had been any miscarriages of justice, it would have been really important to me in the Post Office that we actually surface those. And as the investigations have gone through, so far we've had no evidence of that.
Welcome to the Westminster tradition, where we are unpacking lessons for the public service, starting with the Robodebt Royal Commission. My name is Alison Lloyd-Wright, and joining me today on Kaurna Land is my fellow South Australian public servant, Caroline Crozer-Barlow.
Hello, Alison.
And recovering public servant now of Good Government Advisory, Danielle Elston.
Hello, Alison.
This is our first episode of Season 2. Last year we dove deep into Robodebt, telling the story from its inception in the bowels of the Compliance Division to its release on an unsuspecting public to the determined looking away of 2 departments. Along the way we've had lots of feedback asking us to look at other public service failures, from the British Post Office issue to the Queensland Public Health Payroll fiasco. We've also begun conversations with a lot of wise, fabulous people with insights to share. And finally, we've heard requests for some basic explainers for people to use with their teams. So this season, we're going a bit wider. There'll be a bigger mix of episode types, our usual chat fests, some sit-down interviews with people with strong views on public sector reform, and a mini-series on the 101 of government, how to read budget papers, things like that. And we'll look at some other public sector failures as well as picking up the threads of Robodebt. Thanks to everyone for the feedback and even more for the incredible conversations and dialogue. It has been enormous fun. So we've previously discussed the British Post Office fiasco in the episodes on data, and many of you may have seen a lot more media coverage about it as a result of the screening in the UK of a TV series on this, Mr Bates and the Post Office, or Mr Bates v the Post Office if you're American. We thought today we might spend a little bit of time going through some of the key similarities with Robodebt, as always, and with a lens on what public servants might learn. So Danielle, can you remind us what happened with the Post Office?
For sure, Alison. So it starts in 1999, so quite a while ago, much further back in some ways, obviously, than Robodebt. The Post Office, and I will be calling it the Post Office, so just quick segue, in TV shows, radio interviews, other podcasts, so a lot of the evidence is given and they say, Post Office did this, Post Office did that. In one of the judgments, there's quite a slab where the judge is like, you can call it that, but it's stupid. It's the Post Office. I share that view. We're calling it the Post Office.
This is how you can spot people who used to work in Defence Forces as well. They all say Army and Navy, not the Army or the Navy.
Yeah, see,
That's so true.
so the Post Office. So what happens in 1999 is they move all their transactions to a computer system called Horizon. So from then, for more than 15 years, whenever a Horizon terminal in a Post Office franchise said there was more money in the counter than there physically was, postmasters either had to make up the shortfall, the discrepancy, with their own money, or would be prosecuted by the Post Office for theft and sent to jail.
Huh.
Yeah.
And just to be clear here, postmasters weren't like public servants in the way that we might think about them typically.
No, look, the structure of it is interesting. So they are franchisees. So they're often inside a newsagent. There are 18,000 post offices, and they might be a terminal inside a pharmacy or a newsagent. So they're often a small business person who has purchased the franchise.
Yeah.
So there was no actual proof that money was missing, and it was very likely that was just a bug in the system. When postmasters pointed that out, the Post Office denied anything was wrong, said the computer system was completely reliable and nobody else was having any problems. So it's a lot like the, kid saying to the parent, but everybody else has one. And so this question of individual versus collective, and where you have to rely on the mum and dad or in this case, the Post Office, who says, well, you're the only one, which is incredibly gaslighting. Also incredibly untrue. So between 1999 and 2015, 900 postmasters were prosecuted. Many more will have just paid back the money and sorted it out, and also got rid of their franchises where these discrepancies kept coming up and they couldn't figure out why. So it had a huge toll. So what would happen is those discrepancies might lead to bankruptcy. Certainly the prosecution led to bankruptcy and loss of income. Hundreds of thousands of pounds in investment in the franchise, or your news agency was lost. Criminal convictions, so those walking through life after that with a conviction for fraud and theft, which led to mental illness and suicide.
Yeah.
So in some ways, they're very similar, and in some ways they're quite different. So I think the difference between, one of the big differences of Robodebt is scale. So 400,000 people were impacted by Robodebt, and they were the most vulnerable in society, and for whom the government, and particularly DHS, had a particular obligation to. And it made that existing precarious living even more precarious for those people. It was a shakedown for money not owed. Of the most vulnerable people. The post office fiasco affects many thousands of people, but probably less than 10,000. It impacted sub-postmasters, and so, they have, I think it's a cultural thing, it's probably slightly different to Australia, where there's a certain amount of gravitas to their role in the community. So they can conduct a huge number of transactions. A post office is no longer just, stamps and selling. It's got banking transactions. You can get your driver's license. So it's effectively the government front door. So it's whilst you are a franchisee, there's an element of that public sector responsibility and gravitas because you are the front face of government in a small community. So the loss of respect and dignity through that was incredibly catastrophic for these people. Because the numbers are bigger, so they had the resources, they're running a business. Post Office took more from them. And when we get to the kind of how they make the process of making this good, this is why it's so expensive. These numbers are not small numbers. So not that, again, the individual numbers in Robodebt proportionately weren't small numbers, but these are really big numbers. The criminal convictions was about 1,000, and many of them spent time in jail. Unlike Robodebt, this was not an active shakedown. That was not the intention of the program to do this. It was a side effect of them wanting to ensure an efficient functioning, to move everything online before they were ready, to digitise the system and then back the system and not the humans. So the impact or the intention of it was quite different. It was not a compliance measure per se. It was built as a way to make things simpler and easier that just had this side effect of them being able to tell if there were discrepancies in the tills.
And so there's some differences, but obviously there's some similarities as well.
Absolutely. I mean, both DHS and the Post Office deployed the power of the state against the people. So both their legal and their resources, and they just shamelessly denied the facts for really well over more than a decade. Up until 2019, Post Office maintained that Horizon was entirely robust. It said that in parliamentary inquiries, in annual reports, in interviews, despite the fact that they had done a number of reviews that found that there were holes. In fact, before they turn it on, before they turn it on, they know it's not working.
Yeah.
So before they turn it on, they know it's not working, and yet for 20 years after that, their public posture is that there is nothing wrong with the system, and the whole time they know there is. They maintained that no one could access these computer systems remotely and change the figures, when in fact they absolutely could do that, and maintained there was no systemic problem. So back to the old, it's just you, in this many transactions, there will always be kind of one error, and they had no systematised reporting as to why this was happening. Both of these failures have cost the governments a lot more than they ever saved. So yet another efficiency measure that turns out to be really, really, really expensive.
Yeah.
So they're looking at £1 billion in payouts to the wrongly convicted and back to the postmasters who topped up their tills.
That's a lot.
So neither of these scandals were brought down from the inside. So
Which is really interesting.
It's really interesting that it wasn't a review by institutions, wasn't audit, wasn't risk and performance. Nope. It wasn't an internal, whoops, we found something, let's fix it. It was very much like Robodebt, brought down by kind of a tireless group of community activists, journalists, and eventually, just like Robodebt, one legal case that just tips it over the edge. But again, 2009 is when that activist campaign really begins in earnest. So 10 years have gone by, and I don't think I've ever seen a timeline as to kind of where the spikes in prosecutions happen over this long period of time. But in 2009, enough people know someone else, so they start to network together.
Yeah.
And I think that's when it stops being one individual saying, I didn't steal something, and starts being a real network of community activists. They commissioned an independent inquiry in response to MP pressure. And there's a couple of MPs who have been on this for, again, decades.
Yeah, with great names. James Arbuthnot, Lord Arbuthnot. Don't you reckon it's a great name?
That's fabulous. Yeah.
It's fabulous. Yeah.
In 2012, but hid information, dragged its feet. They never conceded there was a problem. Interestingly, there's currently an inquiry at the moment, and so that was in 2012. There's one at the moment right now, and the Post Office was just found to have been not providing all the information in a timely way and hindering the inquiry. So we have no further improved the idea around transparency than they had in their first inquiry in 2012. The group litigation commenced in 2016, and the judgment, in 2019 properly settled the facts of the case and the facts of the Horizon system, and yet they have not settled all the compensation. They have an independent panel that provides advice to them about how they should be going about that. And you just have to do that same thing with Robodebt, which is why, even once we get to the bit, we know we've made a massive mistake. Why does it take us so long
to fix it? And to make it right. So prosecution of innocent people based on what the computer says, not what the people say. Gaslighting people who are asking questions about it. Can see the parallels with Robodebt, but maybe we can talk through some of the more specific similarities with the public service lens. So how the schemes were set up, how they were defended, and what happened in that aftermath once we've realised they were wrong.
All right. Well, so let's start in the similarities in the setup of the scheme, right? So the thing that really strikes me listening to the really good British Post Office podcast, which we'll post a link to, is that at its heart, and just like Robodebt, it's about a lack of compassion or care for the impact of your institution on others, right?
Yep.
Like these institutions had to look at other people suffering and not care.
Yep.
Actively paint them as deserving of the suffering that they were undergoing, and not care. And I think there's something quite interesting, in DHS, you can see there's the kind of welfare bludger narrative. In the Post Office, there's actually a real kind of class thing, right? So Post Office masters are...
Shopkeepers,
right?
Yeah.
It's like Jane Austen. It really is like Jane Austen.
Cheapside.
That's right. And there's some quite interesting sort of stuff in the podcast where they kind of talk about, head office viewed their sub-postmaster franchisees with contempt. And so that to me is like the foundation of the scheme, don't you think?
Yeah, and also just I think an assumption. I mean, I'm not sure about the intention in relation to Horizon, but just that acceptance by both the Post Office and DHS that people are constantly fraudulently stealing.
Yes.
I mean, you're our white collar crime expert here, Alison, not me. And there's means, opportunity, the various kind of things. But I just can't believe that at no point that it struck them as true that this many of a proportion of their own postmasters would be thieving at quite a large scale, and nobody went, is
and
there
equally,
an epidemic of thieving, or is it possible there's some other problem?
Yeah, equally that this many people were misleading Centrelink about how much money they were owed, and like at some point you've got to look at the scale, the proportion, and say something doesn't seem right about this.
But there's also just an institutional attitude component of it that makes me wonder about, if you think that that higher proportion of people are comfortable and relaxed with theft, whether
With
it's
stealing.
with stealing,
Yeah.
does that not, like, who do you hang around with? Like,
Yeah. But it goes to how they're characterising those people. They don't hang around with those people,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
And so it's easy for
Oh,
them
exactly.
to characterise those people as, yes, no one
Other.
I know would steal. But, well,
But the filthy postmaster, like that's, you're so right. So in the first year they introduced Horizon, like I saw some tweet, like their prosecution rate went up 250%, right? So,
Yeah.
so they go from kind of prosecuting one every, 3 months to one every week. Like that's a big deal if you're the compliance division. And I think I was listening to someone talk about this, and what they say is, and the compliance division were like, aha, the Horizon system is now catching all those filthy people who've been stealing from us all these years before,
Yeah.
and we've never been able to catch it.
yeah, so they didn't look at it and go, maybe something's wrong in the system. They went, the system is inherently right.
Hooray!
And because it conforms to our biases
Yes.
about how these people have been behaving.
you can tell yourself anything, can't you?
You really can. And I think, and this leads on to the second similarity, is so lots of the postmasters pled guilty. So one of the most awful parts of this is that, the post office would go along to them and say, look, I'm going to charge you with both theft and false accounting, but if you plead guilty, I will drop the theft charge.
Yeah.
And you mightn't go to jail. And so hundreds of people pled guilty. Now, the post office, of course, is like, well, of course they pled guilty. They're guilty.
Yeah, they did it.
They did it. There's this blindness to power effects, and we saw this in Robodebt as well. Why did people pay it back if they didn't owe it?
Yep.
Right? Why didn't people appeal? Why didn't people keep fighting? And the idea that systemic power drives people to false confessions is just something that is, you can only understand it if you've ever been powerless in your life.
Yep.
And I just think none of these people had ever felt that powerlessness and that futility of trying to argue with. But, these people had never, experienced that just...
And also just
There's no
needing it
point.
to be over.
Yeah.
Again, something I just constantly go back to with this particular fiasco is how long it went on.
Yeah.
So it's a lot longer. And so I know some of those individual postmasters, if you are 2 years into that conversation and you can't get another job and you can't do this and that, what would you do to have this be over?
Yeah. Just make it go away.
Make
Yeah.
it go away.
No matter how awful.
And there's also, it's
And
similar.
especially if you know in your heart that you didn't do it,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
I'll just plead
Just
guilty.
eat it and it will go away.
Yeah.
and
Oh, and
fine.
even a little bit like Robodebt, there are those who were like, at first I was like, I knew I'd stolen
but
it, but
maybe.
did I do something wrong? Did I drop
Yes.
Yeah.
something? Did
Did
I like?
miscount the cash one day?
Did I
Yep.
walk out in a different way? And there was a lot of people within Robodebt who said, I don't think it's right, but it could be right. But what I am entitled to is an explanation of
Yeah.
how you got to those numbers.
Yeah.
And at that point, I'm happy to pay it back, but I need you to explain to me
Yeah.
how that happened. So it's not even an automatic I did or I didn't. I think, and we're not about theft, but like misaccounting in that thing of like, well, maybe there was £1,000. Maybe I did something, but they couldn't, same as Robodebt, couldn't explain to you how those
Wouldn't
numbers
explain to you.
wouldn't.
Wouldn't explain to you. Wouldn't go back and get the information. Wouldn't do that. Left you in exactly that black box kind of awful state.
And that does lend itself to then going, well, how am I going to end this? I don't have the information to be able to end this.
Yes.
This is never ending unless I submit.
Yeah. So that, and I think that kind of relates to the third thing in the setup that I think really resonates for me on a Robodebt level, which is there was just no incentive for the post office or for Fujitsu to get it right, to actually understand what was happening. So, Fujitsu are the ICT contractor who run Horizon, and there's all this kind of interesting stuff in the podcast about how the contract that they have with the post office penalises Fujitsu for an error rate, right? So that means that if people call the Fujitsu helpline and report an error, it is in Fujitsu's interests to hide errors.
Yeah.
Yeah?
And certainly not to go looking for them.
And not to go looking for them. The post office, on the other side of that equation, A, kind of don't understand the system that they're running, but B, they have to pay Fujitsu money to get detailed reporting out of the system about errors. So the post office has no
Who wrote that contract?
I know, right? It's so brilliantly bad. And then there's kind of more abstract incentives that were working at the same time. So, like post office staff and the Postmasters Association were really worried about the kind of business model of post officing, and they thought that if Horizon was viewed as unreliable, then they wouldn't keep winning the big government payout contracts for pensions and gyro and blah, blah, blah. So there was an institutional pressure. And they had big savings targets, always big savings targets. So, I just think there were no incentives for Fujitsu and Post Office to get things right. And
yeah. And in fact, active disincentives around reporting and monitoring errors. I was listening to something yesterday and they were talking about psychological safety in a workplace as a key foundation for being able to identify and work on mistakes.
Yeah.
And they had found this team that had really high psychological safety, and they went in to monitor their errors, and they get the first kind of report back. And it looks like this team is making a lot more errors. And the researcher's like, oh, this doesn't make sense because, our hypothesis is that they should be making fewer errors. Anyway, it turned out they were self-reporting their errors.
Oh, that's so good.
And so they actually had to send in an undercover researcher to check how many actual errors they were making. And because they were self-reporting in this sort of psychologically safe environment, they were reporting higher errors, but actually making fewer errors.
That is
Isn't that fascinating?
Oh, just totally. And so I think, that's again...
That goes to my issue of complaints, that if the issue is got to close them as quickly as possible and not have many, and if my metric is...
Yeah, if your incentive is not to look for them, not
You
to
won't
investigate
find
them when you find them, not to...
Not to encourage people to
Exactly.
to complain. It's the same thing. It's exactly the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's how it was set up. And I think there's so much detail to this. There's a lot out there. I mean, I think one of the interesting things that a lot like Robodebt, just in that setup phase that you're talking about, Caroline, is it did nearly fall over before it turned on, just like Robodebt.
So there's definitely some similarities in the setup. It sounds like there's also some similarities in how the fiasco was actually kind of managed internally by the post office.
Yeah. They pulled some of our best ofs.
Yeah.
Greatest hits.
There's something amazing about just looking people in the eye over and over again, especially in parliamentary inquiries and stuff, and going, there's not a problem as a way that works. It actually works.
It really does.
So it starts in kind of that low-grade local member question time type thing, and someone asks the question and they say, nope, everything's fine. And that does work each time. For 6 months, it kind of hoses it off, and it's a very similar thing to that steadfastness, and just very clear too, not it could be a thing, we're going to look into it more. Just a total steadfast, nope.
Yeah,
there isn't
a
a
start
problem.
from defensiveness rather than a start from, I wonder if there's anything to see here.
Not even defensiveness, certainty, right?
Yes.
The affect of certainty is so hard.
Certitude.
Yes.
It's amazing. They actively don't want to get to the bottom of it, a lot like Robodebt. And so, they do things like get forced into needing to say they've done a review, so they bring someone in to do the review who's not an ICT person.
And he expresses bemusement.
He's like, I never really understood why they picked me. And they said, you've got 2 weeks, tell us if it's broken. And I kind of lifted up the bonnet and looked around and went, no, it looks fine to me.
Don't you
As
remember?
best I can tell, that's an engine.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
No, you've got 2 weeks to put your strongest case for why it's not broken.
Oh.
It's brilliant.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's quite the...
Inquiry.
And so
request for
again,
service,
this feeds
isn't it?
into the certitude though, right? It's like someone go and find me something where I can say I look like I've looked into it, but make sure we do not look into it all at the same time. And And again, very similarly, it's all about whack-a-mole of today's, what I would probably characterise from there, and there's like, there's whining, this program's not working again.
Yeah.
How can we whack-a-mole it today to move through it, like get rid of it? And it's like a dead cat bounce thing or something. Like, it just keeps
coming back
no matter what they try and do.
Cost still broken.
But it's that whole thing of confidence, and this does go back to kind of trust in government and all of that kind of thing, which is they don't want to look at it because they don't want post officers to not feel like that they're confident in their system. Like, same with DHS, the integrity of of your payments and how that all works. Nobody wants to find it because they're worried that if they find it, A, they'll have to fix it, and B, what will that do to their own personal reputation, the integrity of the organisation, that kind of thing.
Well, and it's even more than that, right? Like, it's nobody wants to look like they think they need to look at it. Like, I think about that Melissa Golightly comment about the legal, we don't want to scare the horses, right? And similarly in post office, one of the general counsel says, hey guys, good idea to do a, inquiry or anything, but just to let you know, any prosecutions that are on foot at the moment, that will be discoverable, and those people we're prosecuting will say, well, even post office isn't sure, they're doing an inquiry.
Yeah.
Right, so like it's not even I can't even show that I might have considered there's something wrong, because in this very moment that will undo me.
Avoid institutional vulnerability at all costs.
Yeah, 100% that.
So I think that's that, and it's don't write anything down. Don't. It's got all the hallmarks of kind of other similar fiascos, which is there must be a whack-a-mole way to make today's problem go away. I cannot look at the system. I cannot look at the systemic. I can't get a report. I don't want to know about any of that.
Yeah.
This individual person's thing, or this MP who seemingly won't leave us alone. Just whack
Deal
it.
with that. Yeah.
And get out of it as quickly as you can. The other thing that's really disappointing and familiar is the aggressive litigation tactics. So not just in the prosecution, even well before that. So the hiding of kind of disclosure, like they were not... Model litigant doesn't go anywhere near of what it's so further away from that. And just trying to like bankrupt claimants.
Yeah.
Just trying to like, we are the government. We can sit here all day long.
Yeah.
This is like, again, back to the child analogy. It's like, I can wait for you. Like, I can stand here all day and wait you out until you run out of steam, or in this case, in money. And so it's like the absolute opposite of a kind of mediated engagement.
Yes.
Like road
interest
to
of coming together.
Find a solution. It was a very aggressive litigation case, which of course we again saw in the Royal Commission for Robodebt was as aggressive as humanly possible against quite vulnerable people. So I think that the response was as defensive, as lacking in curiosity, and as kind of using all of the might of government against individuals because you were so sure you were right, even though you've gone out of your way not to be sure that you were right.
Yep.
And using that institutional might against individuals. So that's where the similarities lie.
Yeah.
And definitely some similarities in outcomes as well, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, this story's not over.
Yeah.
So I think that some of that will still play out. But no one has been found accountable.
Like literally nobody.
The current chief executive secretary, I can't remember what the title of the head of the post of
Postmaster?
Yeah. No, they're the franchisees stuff.
Head postie.
Yeah.
It talks about fixing mistakes and this and that. I must admit, it struck me, and I'm interested in whether we do a mini series on this, which is how to apologise. How to apologise as a government. And when I used
also just as a person.
As a person, but when you are representing an institution. And it just reminded when I was used to do a lot more media, I used to make people watch Peter Beattie apologise because he was the absolute masterclass in in empathetic apologies.
Okay,
maybe we can find a YouTube and whack it in the show notes. I'd watch that.
Absolutely.
So there's no accountability, and it's again that same kind of limp, wishy-washy. Sorry, not sorry.
Yeah.
We'll fix it.
Sorry this happened to you.
Yeah, no individuals who were the people who looked away on purpose, for which there's lots of evidence. They're all still in their kind of their roles. So there hasn't been for any kind of accountability. And for me, that then also comes back to that trust. So if we are found to have made massive mistakes and there are no consequences, noting that we were very comfortable with significant consequences for postmasters and recipients of welfare.
Exactly.
We had a very strong narrative as to why that was perfectly reasonable.
Yep.
Yes.
And a part of the process. If you do X, Y happens.
Yes.
We're getting more and more of these public sector failures where it's like if X happens, if we find that, nothing happens after that.
Yeah.
And then we wonder why punters are like, not sure I have much confidence in you guys.
So Paula Venables, who was the chief executive during the kind of relevant period, so she got there after Horizon had started rolling out, and she sort of oversaw including the very aggressive litigation. She, like, to me, she is kind of emblematic of the attitude, right? Because she has this really beautiful, like, she gives the Peter Beattie kind of vibe. So she would say things like, oh, if there were innocent people put in jail, that would be the actual worst, and we would really want to get to the bottom of it. So she'd go along to these parliamentary inquiries and say these words and then do nothing.
Yeah.
Right? And so she's been stripped of her CBE. So you're not allowed to say, okay, like that's a consequence. That's not a consequence, right? Because she oversaw the false imprisonment of 900 people.
Again,
like, genuinely...
There's a lot to play out still here, I would say, still to go. And I think that the other thing is there still does need to be a priority, not that you can't walk and chew gum, on making good. And yet, again, like Robodebt, they can't figure out who's impacted. They can't figure out how much money they're owed. They can't...
Jeez.
So it's like it's a double down of failure where even when you get to the bit where, no, we have absolutely no defences left, there's nothing we can do about it, definitely all is, you are right, we are wrong, they can't even make good.
They're talking about having to pass legislation to overturn the convictions because they don't think they have sufficient kind of paper evidence to prove each individual case and get each individual case overturned.
Yeah.
Jeez. So they just have to omnibus.
Isn't that crazy? Like,
Far
that is
out.
such a crazy idea.
But isn't this also about the same thing around, this goes back to being able to explain what happened.
Yeah.
Again, there are still people in Robodebt who are like, yes, I got my money back or my whole thing happened. I've got it all sorted. To this day, they can't tell me how they came up with that number.
Yep.
And this is the same thing here. They lift the hood up and they're like, well, it turns out Alison probably didn't steal money. And it's like, cool, where did the numbers move?
Yeah.
Like, how did you...
Yeah.
No, nothing, got nothing. Like, my system can't or won't, don't know, can't provide that information. Won't provide that information.
Yeah.
So I don't know if this is a similarity or a difference. Do you feel, because I do, but it might be my selective media intake, that the post office fiasco actually got a lot more kind of public attention and buy-in and concern than Robodebt did in Australia from just like Joe Public?
So I think my personal view is a TV series is everything.
Yeah, that's what I think too.
Yeah, and so I think Rick Morton's book that's going to come out on Robodebt should be made into a compelling human drama, and then I think we will actually see real repercussions in relation to Robodebt.
I think a couple of things. One is, again, it's a lot longer story.
Yeah.
So they are much further down the road.
Path.
The second part is people respond to stories, not systems.
Yeah.
Like, you have to be a particularly boring nerd, and I say that like
With love.
with love to all my other particularly boring systemic nerds. But for most people, you need to follow the journey of a human, not the journey of a system. And I think that that's where this TV series seems to have tipped the edge, which is people would be like, oh, it's really weird that, so I keep reading this stuff that the government, perhaps they didn't steal anything and they went to jail. Oh, that's all very terrible. Until you are talking about individual people and watching the destruction of their lives kind of in a dramatic form. I think that is much easier to grapple with. And I also think there's some kind of surge in interest in public administration.
That's a nice thought.
Interesting. See, I think one of the differences is the politics of how we talk about welfare recipients in Australia.
Yeah, okay.
It's easier to be sympathetic to your local shopkeeper down at the newsagent
Yeah.
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 than to people you have been told variously at various times by politicians and others were dole bludgers.
So Caroline said that the head office of the post office viewed sub-postmasters with contempt, but that was probably not the experience of the pensioner who went in there every day.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Exactly. And, you know, had a friendly interaction with them while they paid their gas
thought,
bill. And
really? Like,
Yeah.
I would never have thought so-and-so. That's,
Yes.
you know.
Trevor seems so friendly.
Oh,
Yeah.
and you hear these beautiful stories of these communities in
Yeah.
England who would like pack out the court. They would come
Yeah.
in and there'd be like 50 of them standing there saying, not our guy.
And I think that's one of the disadvantages of the victims of Robodebt is lacking that kind of...
Well, so maybe
Social
when they
capital.
make the miniseries, they'll focus on the youth allowance / study recipients of them, like the nurse practitioner who was studying and whatever. Like, and maybe that'll get past the cultural biases that people have. I don't know though. Maybe it'll be focused on Colleen.
All right, any final thoughts on the post office scandal?
Oh, there's heaps to dig into on it, and that I think that we might come back to it a couple of times. There's lots of similarities, and again, I really do think there's a certain resurgence even from not public servants in thinking about how we go about our business, and a real interest in getting it right up front, which I think we're going to talk about in our next episode.
Yeah, and I guess for me it's just like there's something so awful to realise that big institutions have an inertia that is inhuman and self-protective, and that it requires such an effort to ensure that your culture and your behaviour doesn't go that way. Like, because it just feels so the same.
Yeah.
And they're continents apart and a decade apart, in fact,
Yeah.
in some ways, and yet exactly the same.
Yeah.
Chairman Peter Beattie joins us now from the Gold Coast. Peter, good morning to you.
Morning, Carl.
What a monumental stuff-up. Are you embarrassed?
Yes, I am. What we tried to do, Carl, was to look after the welfare of athletes, because they've got to stand somewhere before they go into the stadium, and we didn't want them standing in a field nearby for an hour to do that, so we wanted to get them in early. They came in as part of the pre-show, but we made a really serious error of judgment in not then having them in the broadcast. And I'll obviously contact Kurt Fernley, who I'm a great fan of, and apologise to him today. We should have had them as part of the actual broadcast. We didn't. They were there. Kurt came in with the flag, but it wasn't broadcast. It was one of those stupid mistakes that we unfortunately made.
Just some appropriately bureaucratic disclaimers. Those of us in the employ of the state government speak in a strictly personal capacity, consistent with the Public Sector Code of Ethics that permits public servants to promote an outcome in relation to an issue of public interest, in this case, the betterment of the public service. Nothing we say should be taken as representing the views of the government or our employers. While we've tried to be as thorough in our research as busy full-time jobs and lives allow, we definitely don't guarantee that we've got all the details right. Please feel free to email us corrections, episode suggestions, or anything else at thewestminstertraditionpod@gmail.com. Thanks to Pampot Audio for our intro and outro music. Till next time.